The Arabian Sea in March carries a specific quality of darkness. The monsoon season is months away, the sky is clear and dry, and the absence of cloud cover at night produces a star field dense enough that the horizon between water and sky becomes difficult to locate without instruments. It is the kind of night that makes a ship feel very small and the ocean very large, and it is the kind of night that certain categories of maritime operation prefer precisely because the darkness is genuine and uninterrupted, and the nearest land is far enough away that the lights of human settlement play no role in the visual picture. The vessel that had departed Bandar Abbas 6 days earlier had been transiting through exactly this kind of darkness for the past 72 hours, running without AIS, running without navigational lighting beyond the minimum required by maritime law for a vessel claiming to be a fishing trawler, and maintaining a radio silence that the collection architecture monitoring this part of the Arabian Sea had noticed at 11:14 p.m. on the second night of its transit, and flagged for escalating analytical attention. The vessel was not a fishing trawler. Its hull dimensions, displacement profile, and engine acoustic signature, collected by a P-8 Poseidon conducting what its flight log described as a routine maritime patrol of the Central Arabian Sea, were inconsistent with any fishing vessel class that operated legitimately in this part of the ocean. The acoustic signature in particular, the specific spectral distribution of the propulsion plant's mechanical output, had been matched against a database of known vessel signatures compiled over 14 years of collection in the Gulf of Oman and Arabian Sea transit corridors. The match had not been to a fishing trawler. It had been, with a confidence level the analysis team characterized as high, to a vessel class that had appeared in collection reports originating from 3 separate intelligence compartments over the preceding 8 months, each time in connection with logistics movements associated with a cooperation framework between the Iranian Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps and elements of the North Korean strategic weapons development infrastructure. The vessel had a history. The history was the reason the analysis team's flag had moved so quickly through the command chain. The intelligence picture that had assembled itself over the preceding 8 months was the kind of picture that intelligence pictures become when collection from disparate sources begins to resolve into a coherent narrative. The coherent narrative, in this case, described a technology transfer arrangement of a character that had not previously been documented with the specificity that the most recent collection had achieved. Iran and North Korea had maintained a defense cooperation relationship for decades, a relationship whose contours were broadly understood even in open-source literature, and whose specific technical dimensions had been the subject of sustained collection effort across multiple allied intelligence services. What the most recent collection had added to the general understanding was specific. A description from a source with demonstrated access to the relevant program's logistics architecture, of a physical transfer scheduled to occur in the international waters of the Arabian Sea during a window defined by the intersection of 2 maritime transit schedules. The transfer was not weapons. It was documentation, engineering data, the specific technical package that North Korean ballistic missile engineers had developed over years of testing, and that Iranian engineers, working on a parallel program whose current limitations were well understood by the collecting services, needed to compress their own development timeline by a margin that the sources reporting described in terms that the technical assessment team had converted into a specific and alarming number of months. The documentation, if transferred, would not immediately produce a deployable system. Nothing in the world of ballistic missile development was that simple. But it would eliminate a specific category of engineering problem that the Iranian program had been working around for years, and eliminating that problem would allow the program to redirect the engineering effort it had been expending on the workaround to the remaining challenges. The assessment of the net timeline compression that this redirection would produce had been reviewed 3 times before the relevant commands were given the authorization package that had arrived aboard the USS Bainbridge at 9:47 p.m. The Bainbridge was a guided missile destroyer operating in the Central Arabian Sea on a tasking that officially had nothing to do with the vessel running dark 114 nautical miles to her northeast. Officially. The officer who received the authorization package read it, acknowledged it, and assembled the relevant personnel in the Combat Information Center within 7 minutes. The Combat Information Center of a destroyer at operational speed in the dark is a specific kind of place. The overhead lighting was red, preserving night vision for personnel who might need to move between the CIC and the bridge. The displays showed the operational picture in the cooled, controlled specificity of a system that had been processing the contacts in this area continuously for 6 days. The watch team had been briefed on the general category of the operation 2 days earlier, without the specific details that the authorization package contained, and had been maintaining a track on the target vessel with the particular focused attention of a crew that understands a track matters without yet knowing exactly how much. When the commanding officer entered the CIC and briefed the specific details, the quality of attention in the room changed. It did not become loud. It became more precise. The crew of a warship at operational speed in the dark of the Arabian Sea, given a specific task that their specific ship is positioned to perform, does not celebrate the task. It executes it. The intercept geometry was straightforward. The vessel's track, projected forward from its last confirmed position, placed it in a corridor that the Bainbridge could reach at maximum speed, with sufficient time to establish the intercept ahead of the vessel's planned rendezvous point with the second vessel, the North Korean-flagged cargo ship that the collection architecture had been tracking on a southwest heading from a departure point in international waters north of the Strait of Hormuz. The 2 vessels were converging. Their convergence geometry implied a meeting point approximately 90 nautical miles northeast of the Bainbridge's current position, within approximately 6 hours. 6 hours was sufficient for the intercept, but not generous. The commanding officer gave the order to come to maximum speed at 9:53 p.m. The operation that had been authorized was not a surface interdiction in the conventional sense. The Bainbridge was not going to position herself across the bow of the target vessel and issue a boarding demand over the bridge-to-bridge radio. That approach, legally defensible under specific treaty frameworks for vessels suspected of carrying weapons of mass destruction-related materials, was not the approach the authorization described, because the authorization had been written by people who understood that a boarding demand issued over an open radio channel to an Iranian-connected vessel in the Central Arabian Sea would generate a transmission record, a response record, and an incident report that would become, within hours, a diplomatic event whose management would consume the attention of everyone involved in the operation for weeks. The authorization described something different. It described a covert boarding conducted in darkness by an element already positioned for exactly this contingency. The element had been embarked aboard the Bainbridge for 9 days. 9 operators from a Naval Special Warfare Unit, whose presence aboard the destroyer was documented in the vessel's personnel, manifest as a training and interoperability exercise. The cover had been sufficient for 9 days of open ocean transit. It would be sufficient for the operation's aftermath, because the operation's aftermath was designed to produce no record that would require the cover to survive scrutiny. The 9 operators had spent those 9 days doing the work that the mission required in the space available to them. They had reviewed the target vessel's technical profile until its layout was memorized rather than consulted. They had worked through the crew size estimate and its upper and lower bounds, and the contingency protocols that each bound implied. They had rehearsed the communications isolation sequence in a mock-up built from the Bainbridge's own equipment configured to replicate the target vessel's communications architecture as the intelligence package described it. The data specialist had run his imaging sequence against a documentation package assembled to the intelligence estimate's specification of the transfer package's physical dimensions and binding format. He had run it 11 times. The 11th run had produced the timing that the mission planning had accepted as the baseline. The baseline had a margin built into it. The margin existed because documentation packages are assembled by human beings, and human beings produce things that differ from specifications in ways that cannot be fully predicted. The margin was there for the variability. It would be needed. The team leader had reviewed the mission's timeline architecture with his element on the 7th day, the 8th day, and the morning of the 9th. Not because anything had changed, because the review was itself the preparation, and preparation was the thing that separated the outcome that was planned from the outcome that surprise produces. At 11:22 p.m., the Bainbridge reached a position 14 nautical miles ahead of the target vessel's projected track and reduced speed to bear steerage. The target vessel's acoustic signature, tracked by the Bainbridge's hull-mounted sonar array, confirmed its course and speed were unchanged. It was coming. Its crew, running without navigational lighting in the deep darkness of the Arabian Sea, was conducting the kind of transit that people conduct when they believe they are not being watched. They were not correct in this belief. They had not been correct in this belief for 72 hours. They would not know, when the night was over, that they had ever been watched at all. The 9 operators had been at their pre-launch readiness posture since 10:40 p.m. The equipment checks had been completed and repeated. The thermal imaging system was calibrated to the interior temperature differential that the target vessel's engine plant would produce in the lower hold spaces where the documentation was most likely to be stored. The communications isolation tool had been tested against the Bainbridge's own communications hardware for the last time. The imaging system had run its startup sequence. The breacher had reviewed the locking system profile a final time and confirmed that nothing in the intelligence package's description of the system had changed from what it had described 3 days earlier when he had last checked for updates. Nothing had changed. The mission was what the mission had been. The operators were what 11 days of preparation and 9 years of accumulated operational experience had made them. The insertion craft launched from the Bainbridge's aft deck at 11:34 p.m., in a sequence that the deck crew had prepared for with the same quiet professional discipline that characterized every action aboard a vessel that understood, without being told, that this night was not a routine night. The craft cleared the deck with minimal noise and settled onto the Arabian Sea's surface in the darkness below the Bainbridge's superstructure lighting, which had been reduced to the operational minimum before the launch. The craft ran without lights at a speed calculated to intercept the target vessel's track 3 nautical miles ahead of the Bainbridge's position. The insertion craft launched from the Bainbridge's aft deck at 11:34 p.m. The craft ran without lights at a speed calculated to intercept the target vessel's track 3 nautical miles ahead of the Bainbridge's position, where the geometric relationship between the target, the craft, and the Bainbridge placed the approach in the acoustic shadow of the target's own engine noise. The approach took 28 minutes. The Arabian Sea's surface in March has a swell pattern consistent with the prevailing northwest wind, and the swell was running at just under a meter. enough to make the insertion craft's approach irregular in a way that, to anyone watching from the target vessel's bridge, would be indistinguishable from the random motion of the surface at night. No one on the target vessel's bridge was watching the water in the specific direction from which the insertion craft was approaching. Bridge watches on vessels running without lights in open ocean at night watch ahead and to either side. They do not typically watch astern at an angle 40 degrees off the center line. Hull contact was made at 12:02 a.m. The element was on the target vessel's deck at 12:04 a.m. The bridge watch consisted of 2 personnel. The engineering watch was 1. 2 additional crew members were identified in the crew quarters through the thermal imaging system that the element's point man was running on the internal layout map the intelligence package had provided. 5 crew members total. 5 was consistent with the lower bound of the crew estimate in the pre-mission briefing. The secured watch personnel on the bridge and in the engineering space were located within the first 4 minutes aboard. The crew members in the quarters were secured at 12:09 a.m. without any opportunity to access the vessel's communications equipment. The communications suite had been isolated by the element's signal specialist at 12:06 a.m. as a precautionary measure. Isolating it meant physically disconnecting the antenna feed from the transmitter in a way that was reversible and left no visible evidence of having been done. The isolation was the single most important action of the first minutes aboard. A vessel whose crew understood it had been boarded would attempt to transmit. A vessel whose crew could not transmit was a vessel whose situation could be managed within the timeline the operation required. The data specialist moved to the vessel's cargo hold at 12:11 a.m. The hold contained the documentation package in the location the search protocol had identified as highest probability. A sealed waterproof case secured to the hold's forward bulkhead with a locking system that the breacher had been specifically briefed on. The case was open at 12:17 a.m. The contents matched the intelligence estimate's description with enough precision that the data specialist's response, when he transmitted his confirmation to the team leader, was a single, pre-agreed signal rather than a descriptive report. The signal said everything necessary. The team leader acknowledged and checked the mission clock. The documentation was a physical package, not digital media. Printed engineering data, assembled in a format consistent with the kind of technical transfer that occurs between programs that have, for operational security reasons, chosen to avoid electronic transmission of the most sensitive design parameters. Paper, bound in a specific way. The package was thick enough that photographing it in its entirety, at the resolution required to produce imagery useful to the technical assessment teams waiting for it, would take time. The data specialist had prepared for this. His imaging system was configured for the package format the intelligence estimate had described, and he worked through it with the systematic speed of someone who had rehearsed the imaging sequence against a mock-up of the estimated package dimensions. The imaging took 19 minutes. It took 19 minutes because the package was larger than the upper bound of the estimate by a margin that the data specialist had absorbed without comment and worked through at the pace that the timeline allowed. At 12:36 a.m., the imaging was complete. The package was returned to the case. The case was sealed and resecured to the bulkhead in the position and orientation it had occupied when the data specialist arrived. The locking mechanism was re-engaged. The hold was restored to the condition it had been in before the element entered it. The data specialist transmitted the imagery package to an overhead relay at 12:38 a.m. in a compressed encrypted burst that lasted 4 seconds. The relay forwarded it immediately. The technical assessment team that received it had been on standby for 11 hours. The element began extraction at 12:41 a.m. The crew members were returned to the conditions in which they had been found. The communications antenna feed was reconnected at 12:44 a.m. The element cleared the vessel's hull at 12:46 a.m. The insertion craft ran southwest at maximum speed on the bearing back to the Bainbridge. The Bainbridge recovered the craft at 1:19 a.m. and came to her transit speed and heading within 4 minutes of recovery. At 1:47 a.m., the target vessel altered course. Its new heading took it toward the second vessel, the North Korean-flagged cargo ship whose own track had been monitored continuously throughout the operation. The two vessels met at 3:31 a.m. at a position that the collection architecture recorded precisely, in waters where no surface asset was close enough to observe the meeting, and no overhead asset was tasked to produce imagery of it. The meeting lasted 41 minutes. During those 41 minutes, whatever transfer occurred between the two vessels was conducted by people who believed the package they were transferring was intact and undisturbed. The package was intact. It had been undisturbed, and every page of it had been read by people who were already, as the transfer occurred, beginning the analysis that would inform a technical response program whose development would benefit enormously from knowing exactly what Iran's engineers were about to receive. The target vessel continued southwest after the meeting, its crew unaware. The North Korean vessel turned northeast. Both vessels resumed their respective transits. Neither crew had any reason to believe the night had been anything other than a successful operation. They had made their transfer. The package was delivered. The mission was complete. The technical assessment team that had received the imagery package at 12:42 a.m. had been working for 6 hours by the time the two vessels separated. Their initial read of the documentation had confirmed the source's characterization and exceeded it in one specific dimension that the team's senior engineer flagged at 3:15 a.m. in a message that moved immediately to the relevant commands. The package contained a parameter set that the technical community had not previously attributed to the North Korean program with confirmation-level confidence. The North Korean program was, in at least one specific engineering dimension, further along than the collection had suggested. That information, derived from documentation that had been imaged before it was transferred to the program that would benefit from it, was now available to the technical and policy communities that needed it before that benefit was realized. The gap between what the adversary knew and what was known about the adversary had just narrowed in a direction that favored the people who had spent 42 minutes in the hold of a vessel in the central Arabian Sea. From the perspective of the people who had been aboard the target vessel between 12:04 a.m. and 12:46 a.m., the mission had been complete before the transfer ever happened. The documentation that arrived at its destination was a copy of a copy that had already been analyzed, cataloged, and integrated into a technical response framework within hours of being imaged. The Iranian engineers who received it would work from it. They would make progress. And the engineers and analysts who had already seen every page of it would know, in precise technical detail, what progress was being made, how fast it was being made, and exactly which engineering problems remained between the program and the capability it was building toward. The transfer had occurred. The information had moved, and the people it moved toward were already, in the most operationally significant sense, being read. 114 nautical miles of operational corridor. 2 vessels converging in the dark. 9 operators. 42 minutes on target. 19 minutes of imaging. 0 transmissions. 0 physical evidence of boarding. The technical package that was supposed to compress a ballistic missile program's timeline had been read before the program's engineers touched it. In the deep dark of the Arabian Sea, two ships met and exchanged what they believed was a secret. The secret had already been opened, examined, and closed again so precisely that neither ship's crew would ever know the night had contained anything other than the transaction they had planned. What travels in sealed cases in open water travels alone, unless the water is being watched. In these waters, on this night, it was.